I chose to research this topic because ability grouping is a controversial practice in my district. I wanted to gain an understanding of the controversy and investigate the academic and psychosocial effects of ability grouping on gifted learners. Armed with this information, I hope to be better able to address the concerns of critics of ability grouping in my district and advocate for the use of ability grouping to meet the cognitive and affective needs of my district's gifted learners. Misconceptions about what ability grouping is and is not abound. As Oakes quipped in 1985, ability grouping means different things to different people at different times. In general, ability grouping refers to placing students into different classrooms or small groups based on their achievement, readiness, or abilities. The main purpose of ability grouping is to narrow the range of ability levels so that teachers can provide suitable instruction and so that students can interact with cognitive peers. This sounds innocuous enough, but in the educational community, ability grouping is a hotly contested practice. In fact, in their comprehensive review of 100 years of research on ability grouping, Steenberg and Hugh et al. 2016 contend ability grouping has been one of the most controversial educational practices for more than a century. One reason for the controversy surrounding ability grouping is that it is often associated with tracking, a practice with a historically negative reputation. Many critics exploit this negative association in order to discourage the use of ability grouping. Tracking refers to one specific type of ability grouping, and although the terms tracking and ability grouping are often used interchangeably, researchers draw important distinctions between the two. In tracking, students are grouped by ability and generally remain together throughout their school years. An objective test often determines student placement in a track. Students are assigned to different classrooms, receive instruction from different teachers, and study curriculum that is based on the ability levels of the students in each track. Tracking maintains its negative connotation because it implies permanence. Once a student is started down a track, there is little or no opportunity to change tracks. And there's often also an implication that students assigned to low tracks will not receive a quality education, while students in high tracks will have better teachers and a more engaging learning experience. Ability grouping takes place within the classroom or between classes, and the key difference between ability grouping and tracking is flexibility. Whereas tracking permanently assigns students to groups, in ability grouping, groups are typically flexible. Student achievement is viewed as dynamic and changing, and teachers use continuous formative assessment to make decisions regarding group placement. Steenberg and Hugh et al. 2016 categorized ability grouping into four main types. Between-class ability grouping is the type that is also called tracking. It's most commonly used in grades 7 through 9, and it refers to assigning students of the same grade into high, average, or low classes based on their prior achievement or academic ability levels. Within-class ability grouping is when students within a class are assigned to small, homogeneous groups based on their prior achievement or abilities, and sometimes other factors are considered, such as interest or skill. This form of grouping is frequently used in elementary classrooms, and small group instruction, cluster grouping, and total school cluster grouping are types of within-class ability grouping. Cross-grade subject grouping is the third type of ability grouping, and it's mostly used at the elementary level as well. Cross-grade grouping refers to grouping students of different grade levels together to learn a particular subject based on their prior achievement or learning potential. And the walk to read model, where groups of students of different grade levels which groups students of different grade levels for reading instruction would be an example of cross-grade subject grouping. The last type of ability grouping is special grouping for the gifted, and this category includes educational instructional programs that were designed specifically for gifted and talented students, like pull-out and honors programs. To take a look at the history of ability grouping was actually widely embraced in the United States school systems from the 1960s to the end of the 1980s. However, the practice began to fall out of fashion from the middle of the 1980s to the end of the 1990s, partly as a result of opposition from advocates for equity and equality, most notably Jeannie Oakes in 1985, who argued that tracking unfairly limits educational opportunities for disadvantaged students, and Robert Slavin, who asserted that ability grouping has no effects on student achievement. These critiques had a profound effect on policy and practice, and in the 1990s, several prominent political organizations passed resolutions condemning tracking. Detracking was embraced by a large number of schools, and the percentage of elementary schools grouping students by ability dropped from 80% in 1961 to 28% by the mid-1990s, as measured by national surveys. Ability grouping experienced a resurgence in the 2000s, with No Child Left Behind providing justification for grouping students who were struggling to meet proficiency on state tests. A 2009 survey showed that 71% of fourth grade students were ability grouped for reading and 54% for math. Much of the opposition to ability grouping in the 1980s stemmed from concerns over equity. However, more recently, researchers have argued that ability grouping may actually have positive effects for culturally diverse students and students of poverty. Plucker and Peters in 2018 posited that ability grouping is beneficial for decreasing excellence gaps among students of poverty. In fact, they include ability grouping as one of 6 promising practices for shrinking excellence gaps in their excellence gap intervention model. They cite evidence that ability grouping has been shown to increase the number of underrepresented students identified as high achieving over time, and they hypothesize that the reason for this is that grouping strategies tend to narrow the range of achievement that any single teacher is expected to instruct in a general classroom setting. Other research suggests that the inclusive nature of cluster grouping may benefit culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse students, as it recognizes that not all gifted students are high achievers and embraces all gifted students regardless of their current level of productivity. The kind of variability found in American classrooms makes it difficult for teachers to address the needs of all students. According to a 2008 MetLife survey of American teachers, 43% of teacher respondents strongly or somewhat agreed with the statement, "My class or classes in my school have become so mixed in terms of students' learning ability that I can't teach them." This is understandable considering that studies show 1/4 to 1/2 of students are a grade or more advanced before they enter the classroom at the beginning of the year, and a 6 to 8 year range of readiness levels can be found in any one classroom. Teacher beliefs and the reality of classroom heterogeneity seem to provide a firm basis for the need for ability grouping to help teachers to better meet the instructional needs of all students. Proponents of ability grouping point to its positive impact on teachers' ability to teach and students' abilities to learn. They argue that by reducing the variability in groups' learning abilities and needs, the level of instruction will be relevant to a larger number of learners. Other supporters point out that unlike other forms of gifted programming, ability grouping can be implemented on a large scale for relatively low costs. Cluster grouping in particular can provide full-time gifted services without the need for additional staff. The academic benefits for gifted students of being placed in special groups or programs that are specifically designed to serve their high achievement levels or learning potential are well documented. And Prekel, Schmidt, Stumpf, Moschbacher, Vogel, and Schneider cite several studies that show that gifted students in full-time ability grouping show higher achievement than comparably able students in regular heterogeneous classes do. According to TESOL 2005, both between and within class ability grouping resulted in significant, sustainable academic gains for high ability students. While simply placing gifted students together and not modifying their learning experience does have a small positive effect on their learning, it's what happens within the group that makes all the difference. Without proper differentiation, gifted students will experience none of the benefits of ability grouping. However, when access to cognitive peers is coupled with appropriate challenge, the effects of ability grouping for gifted students are powerful. Critics of ability grouping have suggested that while ability grouping may raise achievement levels for high-achieving students, it hurts the performance of low-achieving students. Some argue that the lack of higher-achieving students in lower-achieving classes deprives lower-performing students of academic role models. Although research suggests that ability grouping does have slightly larger positive effects for high-scoring students, there are still large positive and significant results for low-scoring students, and the estimates for the two groups are not significantly different from each other, which suggests that ability grouping does not cause high-ability students to gain at the expense of low achievers. On the contrary, both groups of students benefit from more homogeneous classes. Gentry, 2016, cites several scholars who agree that grouping by achievement, when instruction is adjusted accordingly, benefits all learners. It is also important that instruction is adjusted appropriately. Caution must be exercised when ability grouping to ensure that all students of all ability levels receive a quality education. Appropriate differentiation hinges on adapting the guaranteed and viable curriculum in order to meet the educational needs of all students. Regardless of ability, all students should have access to grade level standards and the opportunity to engage in enriching educational experiences. When considering the impact of ability grouping on students' well-being, it is important to take not only the academic benefits into account, but also the social and emotional impact. Herman, Schmidt, Kessels, and Prekel, 2016, describe academic self-concept, or ASC, as perceptions of one's own academic ability formed through one's experience in context relevant to learning and achievement. Students have different ASCs for different academic domains such as math, native language, and science, and ASC has been shown to have beneficial effects on achievement, academic emotions, and occupational aspirations. Formation of ASC relies on social comparison processes, in which the achievement level of the reference group, which is usually one's class, is the critical standard. Considering ASC's impact on academic outcomes, the effects of ability grouping on students' development of ASC is of utmost concern. Social self-concept, or SSC, refers to a person's self-perceptions of her social acceptance by others, as well as her social skills with respect to social interactions with others. Social self-concept impacts students' interest in school, student-teacher relationships, the social tension they experience in class, and several other school-related attitudes and beliefs. Like academic self-concept, social self-concept evolves through the assessment of one's own social behavior within social contexts, and therefore the effects of ability grouping on the development of students' social self-concept is another important consideration. As both academic self-concept and social self-concept are developed through the comparison of the self with others in the learning group, it is important to examine how the learning group affects this evaluation of the self in terms of individual abilities and achievements. Researchers describe both negative, contrast, and positive, assimilation effects on students' academic self-concept and social self-concept when they're placed in ability groups. Academic self-concept tends to decrease when students engage in social comparisons with a highly able reference group. And students of equal ability perceive their own ability to be lower when in a reference group of higher rather than lower average ability. These contrast effects are also called big fish, little pond effect, and they suggest that it's better for academic self-concept to be a gifted student in a regular, heterogeneous, or mixed ability reference group, in other words, a big fish in a little pond, than to be a gifted student in a gifted reference group, or a small fish in a big pond. Ability grouping tends to negatively impact gifted students' social self-concept, and this decline in social self-concept has negative effects on feelings of competence, and students may experience increasing anxiety when placed in a group with other gifted students. On the other hand, research shows that belonging to a highly able reference group has positive effects on students' self-concept. Assimilation effect, also known as basking in reflected glory effect or BERGE, occurs when a student perceives similarities between herself and the high ability reference group and feels positive about her abilities. Within school, grouping has been found to enhance reflected glory effects for highly able students. This may be because inclusion in the gifted class or group is more conspicuous when both regular and gifted classes are located in the same building. Both contrast and assimilation effects must be considered when determining the impact of ability grouping on students' academic and social self-concept. While many studies suggest that students do experience a decline in self-concept at the start of ability grouping, the decrease is often only temporary, or it may result in negligible and psychologically irrelevant consequences for the learner. In fact, most of the research finds that the assimilation effect of membership in gifted classes compensates for a negative contrast effect. There are actually a host of positive effects on self-concept for gifted students. Being in gifted classes with more intellectually similar peers leads to an increase in social self-concept because students are treated with less stigma and thus experience fewer social difficulties. Several studies find that children in gifted classes exhibit more interest in school, that interest stays stable over time, and they report better relationships with their teachers than their peers who are in regular classes. Students in special classes for the gifted have higher academic self-concept and higher test scores from the beginning of ability grouping on, and in addition, they kept their higher scores over time and received better grades. These positive effects on academic and social self-concept strongly support the use of ability grouping for meeting the social and emotional needs of gifted students. Despite decades of controversy, research supports the use of ability grouping as an effective strategy for meeting the needs of gifted learners. This is true for gifted students as well as for students of medium and low ability. In addition to the academic benefits, ability grouping has positive effects on psychosocial development as well. When issues of equity and access are carefully considered and differentiation is employed appropriately and respectfully, the benefits of ability grouping far outweigh the drawbacks suggested by critics.